By the time the pile behind Russell Hartley's barn reached 12 feet high, people had started slowing down on the county road just to stare at it. It wasn't a grain bin. It wasn't hay. It wasn't manure. It was a mountain of wood chips. And the strangest part wasn't how much Russell had collected. It was that he kept bringing more. Tree crews dropped them off. Landscapers brought truckloads. Even a local road crew started calling him whenever they had a pile they needed gone. Russell took them all for free. His neighbor, Dale Whitmore, thought the whole thing was ridiculous. One morning, Dale stopped his truck beside the fence and looked at the growing mountain. "Russell, you know most people pay somebody to haul that stuff away, right?" Russell smiled. "I know." Dale stared at him. "Then why are you collecting it?" Russell looked toward his fields. "Because I'm starting to think I've been throwing away something my soil needs." That answer only made Dale shake his head, because Russell wasn't collecting wood chips for his fireplace. He wasn't selling them, and he certainly wasn't building a giant pile just to admire it. He had a plan. He just wasn't completely sure yet whether the plan would work. Russell had farmed the same Missouri ground for nearly 30 years. His father had farmed it before him. For a long time, the land seemed almost impossible to wear out. But gradually, something changed. After heavy rain, water began running across the surface instead of soaking in. During dry spells, the ground hardened quickly. By midsummer, some fields looked tired before the crop did. And every year, Russell seemed to spend more money trying to get the same results: fertilizer, amendments, more fuel, more inputs. Yet the soil itself seemed to be asking for something different. One evening, Russell sat at his kitchen table with a stack of farm bills in front of him. He looked out the window toward the dark fields. Then he asked himself a question that would eventually lead to that enormous pile behind his barn. What if the problem wasn't that his crops needed more from him, but that his soil had been losing too much for years? That question sent him looking for answers. He talked to agricultural specialists. He read about soil structure and organic matter, and he learned something that surprised him. Wood chips weren't simply fertilizer. In fact, fresh wood chips mixed heavily into soil could temporarily tie up nitrogen as microorganisms broke down the carbon-rich material. But used correctly, especially as surface mulch or after appropriate aging or composting, woody material could do something incredibly valuable. It could protect the soil. It could shade the surface, slow evaporation, reduce the impact of heavy rain, and over time contribute organic material as it decomposed. Russell wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for a way to help the ground become healthier, so he began experimenting, and that's when the neighbors really started talking. Dale wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply thought Russell was making farming harder than it needed to be, turning your farm into a dump. "Those chips aren't going to grow anything. How long are you planning on keeping that mess?" Russell didn't have an impressive answer. He was still learning. He spread the chips carefully in appropriate areas. Some went around perennial plantings, some protected exposed ground, some were left to age. He watched, he measured, he waited, and for months, nothing happened. The pile slowly shrank. His weekends disappeared under wheelbarrows and equipment. The farm looked messier. Dale's fields looked cleaner. And one evening, Russell stood beside his field and finally admitted something he hadn't wanted to say out loud. Maybe Dale was right. Maybe he'd spent money and time chasing an idea that sounded good on paper but didn't belong on his farm. Then summer arrived. And with it came the kind of heat that makes a farmer stop checking the calendar and start watching the sky. 3 weeks passed with almost no rain. The exposed ground hardened. Cracks opened across fields. Plants began showing stress. Dale's field was struggling. Russell expected his own to do the same. Then he walked toward the oldest section where the wood chips had been sitting the longest. He pushed his boot through the layer of chips, stopped, then knelt. The soil underneath was cool. Russell brushed the chips aside and pressed his palm into the ground, damp, not soaked, not miraculous, but damp. In the middle of a drought. He dug deeper. The soil broke apart between his fingers instead of coming up as a hard, lifeless clump. Then he noticed something else. Small channels, tiny roots, signs of biological activity. Russell stood up and walked 20 yards to a bare patch. He dug there, dust. He stared at the 2 handfuls of soil. Same farm, same weather, same summer. But something beneath the surface was behaving differently. And suddenly, that enormous pile behind his barn didn't look quite so foolish. Russell began comparing everything: bare soil, freshly mulched areas, older wood chip areas. He watched how quickly each section dried after rain. He checked the soil temperature. He dug down beneath the surface. The pattern became clearer. The oldest mulched areas were changing gradually. The wood chips weren't magically feeding the crops. They were doing something more subtle. They were helping create a better environment for the soil. The mulch reduced direct exposure to the sun. It slowed moisture loss. It protected the surface from pounding rain. And as the organic material decomposed, it became part of a longer biological cycle beneath his feet. That was when Russell realized something that had nothing to do with wood chips. For years, he'd been looking at his farm from the top down. How tall are the plants? How much fertilizer do they need? How big is the harvest? But he'd rarely stop to ask what is happening underneath them. Dale came over in August. He didn't arrive laughing this time. He walked into Russell's field and knelt beside the older mulch. Then he pushed his fingers into the soil. He looked at Russell. Long did this take? Russell thought about it. Longer than I wanted. Dale smiled. That's not an answer. Russell laughed. No, it took time. That's the answer. Dale looked across the field, then toward his own property. Think it would work over there? Russell didn't tell him yes. He simply said, depends on what you're trying to fix. That answer stayed with Dale by autumn. The giant pile behind Russell's barn was almost gone, not because he had thrown it away, because little by little it had become part of the farm. And the most important change wasn't something Russell could measure in a single afternoon. It was that he had started treating soil as something alive, not simply something crops stood in. The lesson wasn't that wood chips belong on every field. They don't. Crop type, soil, climate, pests, equipment, and management goals all matter. And fresh woody material should not simply be tilled into crop soil without understanding what it will do. The lesson was bigger. Sometimes what looks like waste is only waste because we haven't discovered its proper use. That 12-foot pile everyone laughed at had taught Russell something his fertilizer bills never could. You can keep feeding a farm from the outside. Or sometimes, you can start by taking better care of what is already beneath your feet. So let me ask you this. If a truck pulled up to your farm tomorrow and offered you a huge pile of free wood chips, would you take them or tell the driver to keep going? And if you've ever used wood chips, mulch, compost, or another form of organic material on your land, what happened? Tell us where you farm and what works or doesn't work for you. Because sometimes the best farming lessons aren't found in a textbook. They're found in the ground.